Well, the former mayor and police chief of Coffee City, Frank Serrato, will never work in law enforcement again. In exchange, a judge dismissed 5 counts of tampering with government records. KLTV7's Zori Jones was in the courtroom.
It wasn't a dramatic moment in front of a judge. Instead, inside the Henderson County Courthouse in Athens, 56-year-old Frank Serrato sat beside his wife as his attorney, James Mills, walked up to him, handed him a paper, and told him they were dismissing it. The former Coffee City mayor faced 5 counts of tampering with government records, charges that have followed him since December of 2023. An indictment showed Serrato withheld information from his personal history, information the Texas Commission of Law Enforcement required to be disclosed. Today, those charges are on their way to being dropped in exchange for one thing: the surrender of his peace officer's license. Serrato has already signed off on his dismissal agreement. Serrato served as a Coffee City police chief before becoming mayor. After leaving the courthouse today, Serrato declined to speak on camera, but he did answer questions I asked. When I asked what he wanted people to know, he simply said the truth and not to be quick to judge. Zori Jones, KLTV 7 News.
Now, Serrato still lives in Coffee City, where he says he's focused on a new chapter.